Our sixth principle reads, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. For those English majors in the room, you'll note that there's actually no verb in that sentence or clause. The verb is in the preamble to all of our principles. We affirm and promote the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. So, congregation, do you affirm the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all? Yes. Great. An affirmation is necessary, and it's good to do it plainly, but it's also really pretty easy. I am more interested in the second verb. So, congregation, do you promote the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all? I think you do too. I know some of you have in fact made a career of it, working in the foreign service or doing a stint in the Peace Corps or AmeriCorps. In fact, BB is about to head out to AmeriCorps in February. I know some of you have or are currently working with refugees and immigrants. But for the rest of us, as a principle around which we can orient our lives, as a principle of our chosen faith, how do we promote world community? And I don't mean this so much as a challenge. There are times when I stand before you and I say, prove it. But this isn't that. This is more of an invitation to imagine ways in which we can actually and actively promote global world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. How do we do that? So as that seed germinates, maybe we should spend a little bit of time talking about what world community actually means. And I have to confess that this has been the principle that for me, among the seven, has really not resonated very powerfully over the years. First of all, the ambition of it is immense. World community. So I would always read it and then sarcastically into myself say, yeah, right. Okay, and I'll just skip that one because, don't hold your breath. Then I would almost immediately think, thank God I could disregard this principle because one world government. Now this may not plague you all, but I'm somewhere in my like adolescent experience was this notion that the book of Revelation said that the one world government was an apocalyptic prerequisite. And so I've also discovered in writing this sermon that evidently for me, sarcasm opens the door to the irrational. And I was a kid in the evangelistic 80s, and Armageddon was very, very popular. So I'm not proud of it, but I bring it up just in case your inner libertarian is also freaking out when you hear the phrase one world or world community. Because, and maybe I'm just preaching to myself now, but it doesn't say government. It says community. It says community. And when you start thinking about it in terms of community, world community, well then it's not only less alarming, it's also more realistic. And in fact, it sounds downright possible. I have to do that work every time I read that principle. So it's community, not government. But the question to which I am led next is, okay, what do we mean now by world? In other words, what kind of community does world community include? And I guess what I am driving at, and probably inspired by the talks in Paris this week, is, does world community include the world itself? Does it include community with not only each other, not only with strangers, but with the world, the earth itself, with the shrinking diversity of life, with the processes, events, and beings that are of the world? How can you have communities of events, though? From my perspective, we are, as individual humans, ourselves and each one of us, actually communities of events. You've heard me say it before, and the Buddha well before me, but my understanding is that we are composite beings, created by our contexts and contingencies, and that very basically includes all the events that take place within us, and on the microscopic level, and on the biological level, as well as the external, so-called external, human scale events in which we participate and find ourselves. So for me, it's very important to understand that we are communities of events, because the world is a community of events. It gets a little trippier. You could then think that perhaps you can be in relationship personally with what you would oftentimes think of as an event. You could relate to an event as you could relate to a person. Or you could relate to a person as a community of events. Now, I imagine that might change you. When I do it, I feel as though it changes me. I think it changes identity. And that's actually what I think needs to happen as we consider world community, is a consideration of identity. See, one thing I know for certain is that without the world, there is no community. And as climate talks wrap up in Paris this weekend, I actually find myself wondering what it would take to get me to care. What would it take to get me to care more? What would it take to get my care up to the level that the crisis demands? What would I sacrifice? Because it appears that we have painted ourselves into a corner, and we as a culture and species either willingly change our ways, or they will be changed for us even more unpleasantly. And this comes down, for me, to a question of identity. How can I identify more with the world so that I feel like I really and truly have something at stake? Preferably before catastrophe strikes me personally. I sacrifice for my kids. I sacrifice for my ambitions. I sacrifice for my congregational community. And I do that because I see all those clearly as part of who I am. I am bound up with them in very intimate and determinative ways. They are a part of who I am. We make each other, and I know it. I know it in my bones. I don't have to think about it. Knowing it is important because we are just the same, bound up intimately and determinatively with our world. I'm just not sure that we know it. We already are bound up with our world community. I'm just not certain it's entirely embedded in our nature. Our world is a part of who we are, but I'm not sure how well we do that. I'm not sure how well I know it. What I do know is it's getting increasingly important to know it. And so how? How do I get this in my bones? To the same point, I hear the girls crying at night. I get up out of my bed, I go in and I see what's the matter. When I hear that cry, even though I'm dead tired, right? It's second nature for me to check. So how do I get my response to our global community to be that deeply ingrained? And I think the answer harkens back to our earlier question: how do we promote world community? By being world community. By enlarging our identity. Enlarging our sensitivity to all the events that we are. All the events in this room. And then the next question is, how do we do that? So how do we enlarge our sensitivity to all the events that we are, so that we can all the better promote world community? That even broader collection of events. And in some ways, I know I have overcomplicated this. That is how I roll. That is what I do. What we're essentially talking about here is empathy. Real empathy. The kind of empathy that our seventh principle would have us embody. The kind of empathy into which the understanding, affirmation, and promotion of our interconnectedness calls us. The kind of empathy that leads us to the realization that what happens to our world happens to us. Empathy is about identity. And let us not be satisfied with understanding. Let us not be satisfied with agreement. If you agree, let us not be satisfied by the mutual affirmation in our principles. Rather, let us ask what work we need to do and do it. Let us ask, where do I start? Where do I start to promote world community? Where do I start to save the world? And not in dismay, overwhelmed by the complexity and sordidness of our human Leviathan-like systems that have led us to the brink of planetary catastrophe. No, that's the wrong spirit. We need to ask, so it's not, where do I start? It's, where do I start? Sign me up. And I could actually tell you where to start. Some days, I have an answer, and it's an easy one. I may not be the full answer, but I do know where to start. You have to start where you are. It starts with the essence of you right now, with the story that you tell about yourself, with the story that we tell about ourselves. No matter what story we're telling, it calls us out. Our stories about us determine what we do. And this one will be no exception. If we adopt the story that our principles promote, our principles are a story themselves, about ourselves, and they have given us this beginning. World community with peace, justice, and liberty for all. And I offer you a distillation that may clarify the mission that that story sets upon us. And the distillation is this: I am the world community. I think that has fairly profound implications if you pursue them. I am the world community, and the community that is the world is in me. In this story, perhaps we draw closer to understanding the world is part of who we are, and we can begin to realize what is at stake and be called by it. I am the world community, real felt empathy into a larger sense of identity. I am the world community that I seek to promote. And here's why I believe this is fundamental and important. Well, it's also subtle and hard to hold, and I understand that. And so the second way to promote world community is actually to practice it, to practice empathy. And we have this opportunity every time we gather here in this community. We actually do this. So what I'm saying is that by practicing empathy with each other, we are practicing empathy with an increasingly larger frame of reference until it includes the world. So every time we gather, we have the first step of that process. We practice empathy with each other. In much the same way that last week I urged you to prepare with platitudes for the larger tests sure to come, this week I say that our practice of empathy with each other serves a larger purpose. To prepare for the larger test of empathy that is now upon us and will be upon us for the rest of our lives. Practicing with each other enables our empathic abilities. We get better at it. We can do this and must do this same exercise beyond our community as well. That's the next ring of the circle, so to speak. And this morning, I would like to invite you to do so very practically. It starts with an exercise of imagination. I want you to imagine what it is like today to be a Muslim in America. Can you extend your identity to the point where you can imagine what it is for you to be a parent of a Muslim child in Tucson today? According to the FBI, here's some tools for your imagination to take hold of. In 2014, even as the total number of hate crimes dropped in America by nearly 8%, anti-Muslim hate crimes rose 14%. It's expected to rise again in the year that we're finishing up. A 2014 California survey of students by the California chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations shows that 55% of Muslim students in California reported being the target of verbal abuse and insults. It's twice as many students as those who report being bullied based on gender and race nationality. And 1 in 5 Muslim students in California said they experienced discrimination by a teacher or administrator, and of these, only 42% said that reporting the problem to an adult made any difference. So not only are you getting harassed, but the people that you rely on to fix that aren't quite getting the job done. Furthermore, according to Lori Goodstein of the New York Times, in the aftermath of the attacks in Paris and San Bernardino, Muslims and leaders of mosques across the United States, they say they are experiencing a wave of death threats, assaults, and vandalism, unlike anything they have experienced since the aftermath of 9/11. This year has seen 53 attacks on mosques, with 17 of those happening since November. Another one occurred yesterday near San Bernardino. So how do you imagine that feels? How do you imagine that child feels in that environment? So let us practice empathy then. Let us promote world community. And I would like to present you with one opportunity to do so. So this reads, Assalamu alaikum, meaning peace be upon you. It is the traditional greeting among Muslims. It is also on the back of what is meant to be some stationery that you have in your hands. That stationery will also be on some tables outside of service, after service. If you advance the slide, Ricky. This is a form letter that I have prepared. I want you to know that I was very careful in writing it. I wanted to be very conscious of my own not knowing. The last thing I want to do is cause accidental offense. So I invite you, even in this very moment, right now, to pen a letter of care and encouragement and comfort to those afflicted. I would strongly urge you to make use of the words in the form letter. And I've vetted this with colleagues just so you know it's been vetted somewhere. I would encourage you to write in your own handwriting a similar letter or the exact same letter. And I would, if you diverge from it, strongly counsel you to avoid mentioning anything political at all or theological. Let it be a statement of care. Now, as you exit, you could put the letter right on the edge of the greeters table over there. I will collect them. I will put them in envelopes with the return address being this congregation. I would deliver them to one of the Islamic gathering places, either I think there are 2 mosques and 1 or 2 Islamic centers, one of whom is homeless currently. I would deliver those letters to their leadership for them to do with them as they will. Our children are writing letters also. Those letters will go to the children in those centers. And I believe we have an example. Can we see what you guys have done? So this card will be delivered to the kids of a mosque or Islamic center. It says, "Peace be upon you," with the peace symbol. And it has been signed by several of the young people with some well-intended decorations. Peace be upon you, Amani, peace be upon you, lots of peace be upon you, and then some just nice decorations. I think I know who did those. And there's some on the back also. So the kids in RE are understanding how to promote world community, how to increase their empathy, how to comfort afflicted persons. And hopefully increase our identity. May we do this in order to comfort the afflicted, and may we do this to practice being empathic, to practice increasing our sense of who we are as interconnected collections of events, to practice being and feeling and being our world. And with that understanding, may we make ourselves accountable to the consequences of action and inaction. And may we meditate upon what it is that we will sacrifice ourselves for us, for our world, for each other, in order that the affirmation of our sixth principle turns not only into promotion but a way of life. So that we actually might see and be a world community with liberty and justice for all. We'll leave this up.